Okay, so I've got 15 minutes to talk about land. I'm going to start with a kind of a broad perspective on land. My background is as an economist. I used to work for the New Economics Foundation in the 1980s, and even then we were looking at the issue of land and how we could try and find mechanisms to deal with it. So, but now I work partly with Schumacher College and also partly with an organisation called Wessex Community Assets, and we have a large programme of community land trust housing projects in Devon, Dorset and Somerset, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that and how that can potentially relate to self-build. And I'm going to try and get this to work, and I might just forget it and press the button. Okay, so I teach on a master's program in economics that we run with the Transition Network and the New Economics Foundation. And I took my students to Ashley Vale 3 or 4 weeks ago, and they were really struck by the self-build project there. But we were having a conversation about the land element, because most of you will know that when those houses were built, they cost about 140,000, but now they are going for about 600,000. And that's not to do with the kind of the actual structure, it's to do with the way that land is inexorably rising in price. And so I think that we have to address this issue of land and think about it when you're thinking about your self-build project. So anyway, I was asked to come and talk about this a little bit and to talk about how do we secure land for self-build. And it's a sort of an interesting question, because at one level it's a very easy issue. Basically we want to get it free, or we want to get it cheap. And in a way I could sort of stop there, because that's your challenge. You've got to try, ideally, to get it free or get it cheap, and I think this afternoon is looking at ways that you can do that. But I think actually it is more complex than that, so I'm going to try and sort of give a bit more than that. Okay, so I've only got 15 minutes, and I've got far too many slides. I was going to have less slides, but I live in Dorset, and I drove to Tiverton Parkway Station. I don't know if anyone knows it, but there's a big car park there, and it was completely chocker. All the pavements were full of cars, and it was absolutely impossible to park. So I had this wonderful idea of making my talk a little bit shorter on the train, and ended up having to drive here. So that's my excuse if there's too many slides, but you'll get the slides and you can have a look at them. Anyway, I think it is just useful to bear in mind this context around land, which is that we're not building enough homes. That's part of the reason why house prices are rising. We've also got this issue about rental. Obviously that rent is getting too high. And basically what we're seeing with land are, from a kind of systems perspective, is these positive feedback loops, these kind of reinforcing loops where basically housing is getting more expensive, so it encourages people to speculate in housing. That's encouraging more purchase of housing, etc., and things like buy-to-let. So we know that there are 4 million people priced out. We know that housing is becoming incredibly unaffordable. This was something that The Guardian put up, and you can play with this quite interesting website. So you can put in your postcode, and here's Bristol, and basically the median house price is 7.7 times your salary, and in 1998 it was 3.7 times the salary. So, but the issue there is, I would say, is not really the cost of building the houses, it's the land element that is the bit that really people are speculating on. And so we really have to try and get to grips with that. So anyway, that's the kind of positive feedback loop that you get in housing, and you can look at at your leisure, but that's really something that we have to bear in mind in this when we're thinking about self-build, as I say. So today we're talking about land availability and cost, but actually we need to see that in a broader context. So you have the land side, you have issues around construction methods and design, because obviously, as we heard yesterday, that can reduce the cost of the housing. There's the cost of financing, so if you can get low-cost finance, that helps as well. And then there are these sort of broader kind of contextual issues that you get around housing. So, for example, at the moment, this current obsession of the government with pushing home ownership rather than social housing and rental housing. It's the taxation side. And then there's this thing about cultural norms and lifestyles. And I'm going to come on to this in a little while, because in this country there's a tradition of basically having your own house. And so people in this room might feel comfortable in working as a group to do a self-build development, but you're going to come up against people who are going to see you as, a bunch of hippies, basically. So we have to kind of work on that dimension as well. Okay, I'm not going to talk about that slide. I work at Schumacher College, as I say, but I also work for this organisation, the Wessex Reinvestment Trust Group, which we set up about 15 years ago. And housing was one of the areas that we were particularly interested in. One of our sort of member organisations, Wessex Resolutions, does home improvement lending, and we have about £8 million lent out. But the organisation that I work for is Wessex Community Assets. And as I said, we have this community land trust project. So obviously you're not, if you're thinking about self-build, necessarily looking at a community land trust approach in the sort of purer sense. But I think that actually you need to think about whether you need a trusteeship element in your project. And that's what I just want to cover for the rest of the talk. So there's a very interesting organisation in America called Burlington Associates, and it's made up of people who've been very involved in the community land trust movement in the northeast of America. And they have some wonderful information about how you go about community land trusts. But essentially what they're saying is that we have to always think about the home and the land, and we have to sometimes think about those things separately. And in America, where this came from was that, well, first of all, they were inspired by the Indian land trusteeship movement, which Gandhi had encouraged, and then one of his colleagues, Vinoba Bhave, developed into the Gramdan and the Bhudan movement. And it was the world's biggest land reform movement. Basically, it was encouraging existing landowners to pass their land over to people who didn't have land. What happened initially is that they passed that land to individuals, but then those peasants that took on that land, often they would get into debt, and they, after a while, would find that they were having to sell their land back because of their debts to the very people that had given it in the first place. So that movement in India shifted to a village trusteeship movement, where the land was put into trust. And that kind of solved that particular problem. And that then provided the inspiration for people who were involved in the civil rights movement in America to take on this idea of land trusteeship. And it was used in the south of America, and then it went up to the northeast, where they had the same sort of problems that we have in the southwest, whether in an urban area like Bristol or a rural area like Dorset, where I live, which is that you've just got this pressure on land prices. You can continue to build houses at the same cost and perhaps even reduce that cost, but the market is pushing up the cost of the land. So what they did in America was they found a way to separate the ownership of the land and the ownership of the housing. And they did that by putting the land into a trust, and then they had full repairing leases on the houses. And some of those might be houses for sale, some of them might be a self-build development. But the principle was to separate the land ownership. In this country, we also have quite an interesting similar sort of approach with the garden cities that were developed in places like Welwyn and Letchworth. And it's very interesting to look at the history, and there's been a renaissance of interest in those garden cities again, taking a similar sort of line. Okay, so in this country, in around 2000, there was a very interesting report that was written called Common Ground for Mutual Home Ownership. It's still available on the New Economics Foundation website, and I really recommend this report. This is really a seminal report for anybody who's interested in housing. It was written by Pat Connaughty and a number of colleagues, and what they were looking at was how can you take the best features of a community land trust and also the best features of what you have in Scandinavia, which is limited equity housing cooperatives. So what they recommended, and I'll kind of explain this in the last couple of minutes, as I haven't got too much longer, is a way of linking together a community land trust and a limited equity housing cooperative. And some of you who've been here the last couple of days will have heard of this thing of a mutual home ownership society. It's the model that Lilac took for their co-housing project in Leeds, and many others are looking to take this particular model. Okay, so I'll just say something about the community land trust work that we do, because there's something there about how we access land for those projects. So Wessex was involved in a rural pilot scheme for community land trusts, and we got involved with the High Bickington project in Devon, which was talked about yesterday, Buckland Newton in Dorset, and a number of others. And the point was made that these were kind of pioneer projects. There wasn't finance in place, there weren't the legal arrangements in place. High Bickington took more than 12 years, Buckland Newton took 7 years. So this was a very long process. So we needed to find a way to accelerate that process. So then, for our second round of projects, we've worked in partnership with 4 housing associations. You can see the ones there. And we have a programme of 24 community land trust projects across Devon, Dorset and Somerset. And of those 24 projects, 12 have completed. So we have a programme of around 123 houses already built. Here's some examples of those. And then we have a second round of projects that are happening now. So this one is quite an interesting one in Cristo, which is on the edge of Dartmoor. And it's being done in partnership between the community group and teen housing, and also the district council, Teignbridge District Council, have also been a very important partner because they gave the land for free. But they were only prepared to give the land for free if there was a very robust mechanism for holding that land in trust and ensuring that their initial subsidy remained in place in perpetuity. This is really important. So if you're talking to people like local authorities who have land, I think most of them will want to know whether that subsidy that they're effectively giving you can be locked in, so that you're not having this is not a criticism of the yard, but you don't want the situation where people are building houses for 140,000 and then a few years later they're being sold for 600,000. So there needs to be this trusteeship mechanism for the land if you're going to be able to persuade people to give you land free or cheaply. This is another scheme that we're involved in Chagford. This land is not being got for free, but the affordable housing are being subsidised by open market sale of half of the houses on the scheme. And so we've gone in to basically negotiate a deal with the developer so that the community land trust can basically take on the affordable housing requirement of that developer. So that's another way that you can get land effectively cheaply or free. You can do these kind of deals with developers on these sorts of sites. So just very briefly then, what you're doing with any development is you're basically taking a set of resources and you basically turn those resources into, in this case, housing. And so what we've been doing with our partnership projects is saying, is there a way to find a partner that can work with you so that you can accelerate this process? So the projects we've been working with take 2 to 3 years, as opposed to High Bickington or Buckland Newton, which took 7 to 12 years. And then what's happening is that these community land trusts are then, in the future, potentially they'll have the capacity, the confidence to do their own schemes. I'm not going to dwell on this, but this issue of trusteeship, how do you hold the land in trust? In English law, there are basically 3 options of organisations that have a statutory asset lock. So you can see the ones up there, and I won't dwell on them. I've got slides which you can look at afterwards, the KIC, the charitable company, and the community benefit society. We tend to encourage people to look at a community benefit society because it's a very flexible structure. It allows you to do community share issues, which the other ones aren't allowed to do, and they're quite multifunctional. So we can have the same kind of rules which are applicable for housing, but you could use those rules to raise money for renewable energy, for example. And this is the mechanism that we use. So we have a community land trust, and the community land trust essentially gets the freehold of the land, but then it gives a lease, a long-term lease to a housing association. And because of that, the housing association actually, in most of the cases we've worked with, have bought the land for the community land trust. So that's the way that kind of mechanism works, because obviously housing associations have resources to do that. And then the housing association with this community land trust, they do the financing. I'm not saying this is the case for your self-build projects, but this is how this particular model works. Housing association pays a ground rent, and there are various legal arrangements. The problem that we had when we brought community land trust from America to the UK was that we have this thing called leasehold enfranchisement in this country, which they don't have in America. So you can't basically put land in trust and then lease that land, because after 25 years the tenant has the right to take ownership. This is what happened with the garden cities. It's a real problem when they introduced the Leasehold Enfranchisement Act. So what we've been looking at for self-build projects is that you still have the community land trust, but you need an extra structure. And that extra structure is the limited equity cooperative. And that extra structure is structured as a community benefit society. So basically, the community land trust would then lease the land. It would hold the land, but it would lease the land to a limited equity cooperative, and you as self-builders would be members of the mutual home ownership society. And because you've got this structure in between, leasehold enfranchisement doesn't apply. So when you're going to, for example, a local authority to say, we want to access cheap land or free land, you can use this mechanism to say, this will protect your initial subsidy. Because if that local authority just gave the land to a community land trust, we can see with the changes that this government is introducing around right to buy, there's no surety in that that land will be there available in perpetuity, that that subsidy will be locked in perpetuity. So I think it's really important to be trying to sort of understand how we use these legal structures to lock in that initial subsidy when you're trying to get this discounted land from a benign landlord. So that's all. I think I'm finished. So just to go back to my initial thing of get it free or get it cheap, I just wanted to give a couple of examples. So the one on the left is a great story. That's Coin Street Community Builders. They got their land for free from the Greater London Council just before it finished, and there's a lot of not self-build cooperatives, but there are housing cooperatives within that Coin Street development. So it's a very interesting one to look at. The one on the right is the Christo one that I mentioned, where we got the free land from the District Council. And then the other one is cheap land. So the other thing, obviously, you probably all know, is that agricultural land is a lot cheaper than land that has housing, permission for housing on it. An acre of agricultural land will go for £10,000. An acre of housing land with planning permission might go for £1 million. And so, so it can be a good idea to. This on the left is Five Penny Farm in Dorset. Jyoti Fernandez, who's very involved in the land and various planning campaigns. They got land. They wanted to build their own house, but they didn't have planning permission, so they were able to buy land at agricultural value, and then they were able, after a long process, to get retrospective planning permission for the house that they self-built on their land. So that can be a way of doing things, and that's what the Ecological Land Cooperative are doing. They're buying up agricultural land in the hope that they will be able to get planning permission for small holdings. So that's another way of doing it. So that's my 20 minutes. My contact details are there, and if anybody wants to follow up any of these ideas, I'm sure they'll be discussed more this afternoon and this week, but I'm happy to be in conversation with people about that. Okay, thank you.